Greetings, humans. This is just an ever so brief note on how to study anatomy. I mean, first you have to have the tiniest bit of history and try and understand where medical lingo comes from. It comes from church. What happened was churches gathered knowledge as knowledge was produced, the Catholic Church in England up until whenever, and society collapsed. All of society collapsed in England and in Europe like 3 times between the 14 and 1600s. Three successive plagues rolled through, and each time a plague rolled through, it wiped out like a third of the human population, so that things like knowledge of medicine were no longer sustainable. All of the infrastructures broke down, and people were just like grubbing in the dirt, hoping to have enough food to eat. And very difficult times where like learning things would be super secondary, if you see what I mean. And but the churches held on to knowledge when society became functionally illiterate and forgot all of the things that the Greeks and the Romans knew. At the same time, this created and maintained a power structure. The power structure was that the people who know things are powerful, the people who know things are priests, priests are powerful. But then eventually, like, plague time was over. The end of the Dark Ages gets around, and we get to the Restoration, sort of re-enlightenment period, which is fun. But knowledge is not merely rediscovered, it is released back into society from the church, but it's released back into society in Church Latin. It's released in Church Latin and Greek. So all of the colleges and universities, the very first colleges and universities, they taught in Greek and Latin. Latin was the language of science until about 300 years ago, when the Royal Institute kind of forced English to be the language of science and started launching educational journals, print journals, science journals. So the very first people doing medicine and doing anatomy, they had the right and privilege, I suppose, of naming all of the parts of our bodies, right? So when you're going through anatomy, this is relevant to psychology because we have to do neuroanatomy. When we're going through the various parts of the body, what we have is these lists of body parts, brain parts in Greek and Church Latin. That was the power structure of the time. That's how the power structure was maintained. That's how power was co-opted from the church by science. In the beginning, you build these great big educational institutions and you staff them with church deacons and pastors and priests, and then slowly you move away from the church as the educational model towards a scientific model. But in the meantime, you've named everything in Latin and Greek, and you have to read Latin and Greek to understand Newton, and you have to read Latin and Greek to understand Copernicus and any goddamn thing going on out there. But by modernity, there's no reason to refer to this bone in your arm as the humerus. We could just say the upper arm bone, and everyone would know what you mean, and you don't have to say the humerus to refer to that thing. So one thing we keep doing is like oppressing students with these lists of just church Latin and Greek terms, and you don't speak Greek or Latin, you don't read and write Greek and Latin. The people who came up with this stuff did. What they were literally doing was they were looking at the stuff that they saw and trying to make some easily recognizable or memorable association to it. So when we talk about the hippocampus, it's the part of the brain that looks like a horse. That's what hippo means. It's the horse-shaped region of the brain. And when you're talking about the hypothalamus, hypo means underneath. So they remember the thalamus and then the thing that's under the thalamus. And it really is this stupid. Honestly, it really is this stupid. It's a few dudes who know church Latin and Greek, looking at parts and naming them by what they look like that they're already familiar with. That's a power structure. And the point of that power structure is to keep the riffraff out. And you and me, ladies and Germans, we are the riffraff. So I'm going to teach you just a little bit how to cheat that. That's a horrible nose. Let's leave that off. That's not much better. Your brain just isn't set up to remember things in terms of lists of weird sounding, foreign words and lists of abstract functions. It's just not good at that. So the way you're trying to study, and if it's working for you, keep doing it. The way you're trying to study is you're making flashcards or something, and you write hippocampus, the part on the front, and on the back you write the part of the brain responsible for explicit and autobiographical memories, and you put that aside, and you get cerebellum, the part of the brain responsible for balance and coordination, cerebellum on the front, balance and coordination, and you set that aside. You get this big stack of cards, right? And then you start going through them, and you look at the first one, and it's the medulla oblongata, whatever stupid thing that does, and you can't come up with it, and so you put it on the left, and you get the cerebellum, you get that one right, you put it on the right, and you go back through all the ones you have on the left, and you do it again, and you're just trying to force information into your head. That can be done, but that is not super memorable. That is, you can do that usually enough to like get a 80% to pass the next mastery test you have to get through, and then forget all about it as you move into the next unit. And that stuff only really starts to stick after many, many repetitions over the course of a few years. But even better when you're using it and you actually know what this part of the brain or part of the body is doing. You've worked on a few of them, and those words start to come ready to mind. Until then, this is kind of a pointless, useless exercise. Your brain is just not set up for that. It's not built for that. What your brain is built for is storytelling. Your brain tells stories. We're social animals, and we're expected to encode about something like 100 social relationships, recognizing faces and names and how people are interrelated and how important they are to you and what happened to them in the past. What were your last encounters like? So we're going to somewhat co-opt that system. When I was in graduate school, cerebellum, one thing at a time. When I was in graduate school, I had the hardest time with neuroanatomy because essentially I don't care about it. I'm an autistic dude. You cannot make autistic dudes learn shit that we don't want to learn, things that we don't want to learn. It just isn't happening. It certainly wasn't happening with me. There was no forcing it. I'm too stubborn. Well, that's a problem because you have to know your neuroanatomy to get your doctorate, and I wanted to get the doctorate. So every day in the break room at the clinic, a client doesn't show up, or I have 10 minutes before the next client shows up. I'm in the conference room, grabbing the pens and drawing these ridiculous characters on the board. Like the weirder and raunchier, sometimes dirty, the more sensory stuff you can get in, the funnier, the stupider the story that you're telling, the better. It makes them all the more memorable as characters. And by the time the neuroanatomy term was over, other people were doing it too. They were coming in and seeing those things and being like, I also have trouble remembering these things. Let's join in the game of just making the stupidest characters that we can think of to make this somehow memorable, to get through that quiz, but also to remember some of the information for a longer period of time. So here's one of them. This one is cerebellum. And the bellum, to me, because you're supposed to do personal associations, like what do these words sound like to you? And the bellum reminds me of the antebellum, the southern belle. And so here's a southern belle dancing. Her name is Sarah. Her name is Cerebellum. And of course, the real thing, right, wouldn't be Sarah with an S. Why are you like this? It'd be like this, the cerebellum, right? and I'm intentionally misspelling it to make it memorable. It's Sarah, cerebellum. And cerebellum is a dancer, because dancing requires balance and coordination. And the cerebellum is this sort of, it's almost a second brain that lives under your brain. And what it is doing is coordinating balance and complicated physical operations into the world, like dancing, right? So there's cerebellum, the Southern dancer, and I will never forget that the cerebellum is the part of the brain that does balance and coordination. Okay, this is a terrible drawing. Like, this is not art class, brothers and sisters and other siblings, right? This is not art class. This is us surviving and getting through anatomy however we can. So let's look at another one. I did these for you. You're welcome. No shade. Yes, I want to do that. So here's my awful rendering of Sir Hiss. Again, it's not art class, but do you remember the 1968 or so cartoon version of Robin Hood? Think back to that thing where Robin Hood had made Mary and her foxes, and Little John is a bear, and there's a lion in there somewhere, and Sir Hiss is one of the advisors to the presumptive king. And in Disney cartoons, these pythons, they hypnotize other characters. Their eyes go all swirly and they sing a little song like "Trust in Me," like that. I think that was Sir Hiss, but it might equally have been the snake in the Jungle Book. I don't know. It doesn't matter. The point is that there's a personal association to it, whether it's right or wrong. And here's my horrible rendering of Sir Hiss, and his eyes have gone all squiggly because he's trying to hypnotize you. And here I'm saying that that Sir Hiss is a not a python at all. He's a related animal. Yeah, he's a python. He's a reticulated python. Reticucated. He's a reticulated python, because what I'm trying to remember is the reticular formation. And the reticular formation is the part of your brain that's responsible for states of consciousness. I don't know why it's called reticular. I don't speak Greek or Latin. I don't know why the python's called reticulated either. I don't care. I just care that we can get to this point where the reticulated python and the reticulated formation both are stood for by Sir Hiss, who hypnotizes his enemies. And I can remember it. It's a comedic character, and it's funny, and it lives in my brain. Like much that lives in my brain, it's stupid. That's somewhat the point. You got to cater to your own knowledge base, right? So here we go. I'll never forget that the reticular formation does states of consciousness. What else did I do for you? Oh yeah, the hippocampus. Another one that's like super obvious, because man, I want you doing your own ones. I want you doing things that that you relate to, that maybe not necessarily everybody else does. But here's my hippopotamus, and he's graduating from Knowledge College, and he went to the hippocampus of Knowledge College, right? He studied really hard. The hippocampus is responsible for memory, for certain kinds of memory. And it's not the file cabinet, but it is the file clerk, and where it knows where all of the bodies are buried, so to speak. It knows where all the memories are, and promotes memory deepening while you're sleeping and all of that stuff. So here's my hippocampus, my hippopotamus walking away from the hippocampus. And I know they're not pachyderms, but they do remind me of elephants. Hippos are kind of vaguely like elephants, right? They're big and they're gray, and you don't want to piss one off. And so here he is. Maybe elephants remember everything, and hippos remember most things. And there's your hippocampus, the hippo responsible for memory inside of your brain case. Okay. All of this time, have you been seeing this stuff? I'm gonna have to go back and watch the video. I might end up having to re-record it. Yeah, so there's that, and that's all I have. So yeah, so you're gonna try and co-opt your brain, use it the way that it evolved to be used, which is You know, can you imagine being on the plains of the African savannah like 50,000 years ago? What use is there in seeing lists of words and memorizing their meanings? Like none at all, none whatsoever. But memorizing the geography and knowing who is friend and who is a stranger and how are you related to other people and other kinds of animals, that stuff is very, very valuable. So you're over specified to just understand the world in that way. Okay, and that's what I have for you. Go forth and prosper and draw a bunch of stupid pictures and comics that entertain you. Okay, bye.